unemployment checks that are often outpaying the standard wage. Do people want to work?
Right now, I think people are terrified to work. Look at, there's been a big narrative around, well, everyone else got off, but I'm an essential business and essential worker, so I had to work. And like, how dare, like, this sucks. I want my time off, and it's that sense of entitlement. I have jobs open right now that I can't fill because currently right now it's more lucrative for you to sit at home and collect unemployment than it is for you to work. And I understand there's definitely needs and there's definitely fear there. But at the same time, a lot of employers are changing the way that they do business to ensure that they have a safe workplace. But then there's also employers that are not doing that. And that's what's terrifying. People, you look at Amazon, for example, they kept operations up. They're going to meet the bottom line. They've been so profitable throughout this entire thing. Yeah. And employees have been getting sick and shutting down. And,
one dude walked away from his delivery truck in like Wisconsin or something.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy the stuff that's going on right now, but I understand there's fear out there, but that fear should be driving you to better employers because there are some terrible employers. I've worked with bad employers in the past and we don't place people there. That's why we focus on finding meaningful employment with companies that actually produce a contribution to society where you can go there and have benefits and take care of your family without having to sacrifice who you are as a person.
So the market does work.
It does. It does work. And that's a big thing that happened recently is, contraceptives. Employers being able to say, hey, we're going to deny birth control in the workplace, and we're going to be able to deny that. Okay, that's how you're going to run your business, but expect for everyone to flock out of there quickly and go to businesses that are progressing and changing the way I don't want to point out companies by name, but like if that is your agenda and that's how you're going to change things, you're probably going to go the way of the dinosaurs.
Right. So when you're seeking these folks to place, what are the criteria that you look for? Just any veteran willing, unemployed, needs work, new, old, like.
So we reach every demographic. Essentially what we want is veterans to come here with a need, disabled veterans. And let me say this first is everyone's hiring veterans. Everyone's hiring veterans like me. Not a lot of people are hiring the veterans coming from Vietnam because they're the ones that are on the streets. And honestly, those guys had a bad shake. And to go back to the question you asked earlier, how do we have it differently from other generations of war? We've been so supported by our community and our country to give us a lot of benefits where those guys didn't have that.
No, they were rejected.
I appreciate the groundwork they laid to give us the freedoms and liberties that we do right now, that we have right now as veterans. Because if they wouldn't have done that, spoke up about Agent Orange or talked about their PTSD stories in Vietnam, they laid all the groundwork to make us comfortable where we are today. And so what I do is I focus a lot on pulling from any demographic in there. We have disabled vets that don't have hands, don't have legs, arms, stuff like that. We negotiate that because employers are scared. Employers are scared to say, hey, sorry, I have to get a reasonable accommodation. What does a reasonable accommodation mean for someone that is blind, that is deaf, that is missing a hand? Employers are so scared of even addressing that they just don't address it. So being an agency, a third party to that, I break down a lot of that saying, yeah, this guy's missing a hand, but he has to push one button. Good thing he has another hand to push a button, because they're so terrified of getting shut down or getting fined for not dealing with that. So what we do is we say, hey, what jobs can this person perform? Where can we put them? And we find those companies. I have a company right now that said, look, I need people to come in that are going to be nice to people that are going to talk on the phone. I'll give them a headset. It doesn't matter if they have hands, legs, eyes, anything like that. As long as they can talk on the phone, I'm going to hire them and hire them at a reasonable wage. And some of these guys, that's all they've been looking for. They don't want to break their backs anymore, and they want to move into a position where they can succeed and not kill themselves.
That's pretty cool. So when you talk about the fear of an employer not making reasonable accommodations, is it because they're afraid of the expense that it would cost them? Or are they afraid of saying, no, I can't take that person on because it's just not part of what we do.
Afraid of getting it wrong, I think is the problem. Is there's not enough being done to handle a lot of those disabilities to say, hey, like, how do I handle this in human resources or as a recruiter or generally like that? And then it goes up the chain. From what I've seen, it goes up the chain and then comes back down. Yeah, we can't make that reasonable accommodation. I've seen it a couple times where at Panasonic, when I was working there, we had a gal that was deaf and all she needed was a light. They just put a light on the machine, and that was it. And it was fantastic. It was easy to get through. But if I wouldn't have taken the time to actually advocate on that person's behalf, which is your job in recruiting and human resources, to make sure that you're trying to fill that position with the best person. If that person needs a little bit of help and you can make that happen, it's up to you to actually to break that down.
My brain's turning. There's things you don't think about,
Yeah.
Because I'm an employer, and we've had people who have disabilities, and we make accommodations. One guy really struggles to type because he has a wrist issue, too much skateboarding, as it turns out. And so he handwrites all his notes, and then we scan them, PDF them into the client document portal, which is like, that's not a big deal.
Yeah.
But it's making me wonder, like, is some of the fear driven by, well, you didn't accommodate me enough, I'm going to sue you?
Yes.
Is that what it is?
Or you're going to pass on me as a candidate, and then you're going to sue. Then they're going to sue me. Yeah. So
Right.
like usually, it's really bad. But usually, I've seen a lot of people that are scared to deal with the issue, so they just pass them off. And in recruiting and in the job search right now, not a lot of people are getting feedback once they apply to somewhere, or like, why not me? And that's very difficult. But I've seen that with disabilities, it extends longer because they say, what? Okay, let me check back. I'll let you know what we can do. And then it gets to the next hierarchy and the next hierarchy. And then someone just doesn't have the time to make the decision. So it comes back down. No, we can't make that decision.
Or
it's tough.
Or how often is it? Oh, by the way, we've already hired someone else.
Yeah, exactly. I filled the position, and usually I feel like it's passing the buck. Whereas what we do here is we're constant. Man, I take that as a challenge. Challenge accepted. Let me find this person a position,
right.
and try my hardest to make sure that this person gets a job, a meaningful job with an employer that's going to value them.
How often do you find it's not necessarily a disability, but an accommodation for language barrier?
That's tough. I feel like that's actually a lot more accommodating than having a physical disability.
Interesting. So what happens in that case?
Typically, they get through, and then you get put on a line. Usually, they try to put you into a department where someone is a Spanish speaker or speaks a second language to make that happen. But and I think we have grown a lot more as a country to accept that, whereas still disabilities are on the table and very difficult to hire for.
And while we're on the topic of disabilities, it may not be a disability per se, but we've discussed PTSD in the past and other forms of mental illness. And this is a mental health podcast, so we'd be remiss if we didn't discuss it. How often are you encountering veterans who need work, could reasonably work, and have a mental illness on board for which they're probably getting treatment? Because if you're involved in their life, you probably hooked them up with some resource or another, and their employers don't want them because of that.
Yeah, it's tough to really show the data behind that. Honestly, I know from my own firsthand experiences more than placing someone because it just doesn't get brought up. And I still think a lot of people are not seeking help enough to actually say, hey, yeah, look, I suffer from anxiety. I need, a day off a month to go spend time with my family or to just wind down, or I need to leave work an hour earlier. Like I can't do a full 8 hours. I need to do 7 hours or 6 hours. Right. I feel like that has grown, but is still like a underworld culture that no one wants to really talk about because people are still scared to address it. I know for myself, I was scared to address it because I was going into work with anxiety, and it made it very difficult to function. And I just played it off like, I'm just stressed out.
What was the turning point for you when you decided that you were going to go get help? Like what flipped that switch?
Really is just, I couldn't function. I'd come into the workplace. I'd get in there at 9:00 and keep it together enough to make it to 11:00. And then at 11:00, I'm like, well, if I can just make it to 12:00, I can go get lunch and at least take a break from all this, because there was a lot more involved, where they're applying a lot of pressure to me as a leader to make people perform, which we were performing at the top level that you possibly could perform, is just unrealistic expectations. But then when I realized how debilitating it was, when I'm like counting the minutes to go to lunch so that I can get out and just breathe, that's when I said to myself, something's got to change. And it was very tough. I was still too scared to bring it to my employer's attention, because I didn't want to be labeled as the crazy veteran, or, the guy that has anxiety, or, strip me from a leadership position, because I was still leading people and still working hard there.
But just white knuckling it through.
It was tough, man. It really was. And white knuckling would probably be the best way to describe it. And then I was like, I can't do it anymore. I want to help veterans. I think I could run my own company and make the changes necessary. And that's when I jumped ship. I jumped ship and said, I've got this. I am going to do it. I was terrified, but at the end of the day, what was I going to do? Show up to work and just completely be stressed out? Yeah. And then when I'm getting home, I'm exhausted. Couldn't spend time with my family because all my adrenaline had been pumping all day long, that when I got home, I had to crash.
Yeah. We hear a lot about this, like in our profession, it's called compassion fatigue, which I think is a terrible name, and it doesn't even make sense. Like, we get tired of being compassionate. It's stupid. But what it means is, like, you basically burned yourself out listening to other people's horror stories, and you didn't know how to separate and leave work at work. Now, other people call that burnout. You're working too hard. You're investing too much. And then there's another version I just heard of called moral injury, where your own ethics and morals are pitted against that of your employer, and they're not compatible, and you're finding yourself at odds, and that wears you out psychologically. And what you're describing is something of a mix, where you're like, I know inside me who I am. This isn't right. I'm full of anxiety for whatever reasons. It could be internal pressures, it could be external pressures, but either way, what it does is it wears your body down, so that when you get home, like you described, you have no energy left. And then you're not being, present or available for your family or whatever it is, your hobbies. If you're not in a family situation, you're single or whatever. And if you're listening to this and you're going through it, or you're listening and you know somebody's going through it and you can recognize it, I think it's important to acknowledge that and say, hey, look, I listen to this podcast. You should listen to it, by the way. Share podcast. But also, like, take the time to validate that for the person and say, hey, it seems like work's really wearing on you. And then maybe that opens the conversation. Go, well, it's actually not work. It's this other thing. So what was your path to recovery? What did that look like? And how did you finally, because it sounds like you had an awareness. You're like, this isn't normal. Yeah. But you're still full of, like, self-judgment, if I can say that. What did it look like when you finally were like, all right, I need to get help. Help needs to look like X, Y, and Z. And then finally you disengaged from Panasonic and formed your own company, which is terrifying, I will agree. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. Describe for our audience how that kind of unfolded, so it's not so mysterious.
Yeah, so they ended up putting me on blood pressure medication to help, because my blood pressure was skyrocketing at the time. So
you went where, to your primary physician first?
Yeah, and then I was going through the VA, and so they put me on blood pressure medication. I said, I think this is messing me up. And
you knew that wasn't it.
Yeah, and I was like, man, I think this is messing me up. And then I was like, can I come off the medication? And they're like, no, just keep taking it. It takes a while to work. Kept taking the medication. Finally, I was like, it's got to be the medication. Cut the medication out. They put me on antidepressants. I was taking the antidepressants. They're like, it just takes 30 days to 60 days to start working, so you just got to believe it.
Did that have the opposite effect?
It was tough for me, man. I had never been depressed in my entire life until I started taking antidepressants. Right. And then I started worrying about, like, how is this going to affect me, like, over time. It had been years since I had, not gone outside or gone on hikes. I was usually out in the woods or hiking or fishing every weekend, if not every other weekend. I completely separated from that and was just taking the antidepressants. I was still battling anxiety. Started the new company. It was tough, but it was like there was hope there that I can change it and I could take care of myself and give myself that time away when I needed it. That helped. Honestly, the antidepressants were hard for me. I ended up one day, I remember I started thinking to myself, like, how is this affecting me? And I still think that, You know, medication